When we last discussed British India, it was on the cusp of a major rebellion. The East India Company had allowed Christian missionaries into the subcontinent, established Western-style schools, and was rumored to be greasing cartridges for sepoy regiments with beef and pork fat. Added to these cultural grievances was the British doctrine of lapse, the practice of seizing princely states that did not possess a natural heir. Should Indian Nawabs and Maharajas die without a son to succeed them, and it was a son that they needed, the East India Company sought to avoid, in theory at least, a deadly succession struggle by making itself the heir and seizing the territory. In reality, the East India Company coveted the revenue from these princely states, which sometimes amounted to more than £1,000,000 a year. Since the East India Company typically lent Indian princes their army to enforce order, this was a fairly easy process, and one that was seen by the British at least as the price of East India Company's support. This was also a process that affected relatively few Indians beyond the prince and his immediate entourage. Land rights, even of the highest levels of the nobility, were typically respected. But in the decade before 1857, the doctrine of lapse came to be applied more frequently than before, with the princely states of Jatpur and Jhansi and a host of other ones being annexed by the British. This made Indian princes nervous. Those who did have male children were generally safe, but in 1856 the Governor-General of India, Lord Dalhousie, invoked a hitherto little-used incapacitation clause to annex the princely state of Awadh. Dalhousie argued that Awadh's ruler, the Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, was incapacitated owing to internal misrule, and that since this incapacitation itself was hereditary, that Shah's son couldn't succeed him either. Moreover, noble land was expropriated on the grounds that Awadh's nobility were caught up in the Nawab's mismanagement of the province and therefore couldn't be trusted. Awadh's dispossessed elite were eager to seek revenge on the British, and they were joined by their nervous counterparts all across India at the beginning of 1857. With only 1,000 white officials in India at any one time, British rule depended on the consent of the Crown's Indian subjects. It was, after all, an Indian army that enforced order. Should this consent ever be withdrawn, British power would be exposed as tenuous and potentially easily overthrown. In 1857, the British learned this the hard way. Soldiers in Bengal shot their British officers and marched on Delhi, where they attracted a groundswell of popular support. Indian princes in the Central Plateau, a broad stretch of territory that roughly corresponds to the old heartlands of the Mughal Empire, backed the rising. The last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah, agreed to serve as a figurehead for the movement. Born in 1775, the now 81-year-old ruler had spent nearly his entire life as emperor in name only, the British government treating his dominion, confined to the walled city of Old Delhi or Shahjahanabad, as just another princely state. The Great Indian Mutiny was enormously destructive. Its sudden outbreak was thrilling to participants, but the lack of a clear chain of command would hobble any attempt to create a unified front against the inevitable British counterattack. Hindu and Muslim sepoys agreed on the injustice of greasing cartridges with beef and pork fat, but many agreed on little else. Mixed units under British officers would often conspire to shoot those officers, but would then divide into Hindu and Muslim units and go their separate ways. Some, ominously for the future, would fire on each other before doing so. The British government rushed troops to central India. Some were units recruited in the British Isles, but most were sepoys from elsewhere in India, units that were not involved in the initial mutiny and were thought to be trustworthy. These included Sikh battalions from the Sindh and Pashtun-speaking Muslim units from the northwest frontier with Afghanistan, the very region now controlled by the Taliban. The mutiny was met with terrible atrocities on all sides. Rebel sepoys mutilated white civilians, and British units annihilated whole villages. By the autumn of 1857, the British had fought their way to Delhi, which fell on September 21st. The last Mughal emperor was put on trial, where where he claimed to be a helpless pawn of the mutineers. This made no difference to his fate. Bahadur Shah was formally dethroned, exiled to Burma, and died in a British prison in 1862. The imperial throne passed to Queen Victoria, who was crowned Empress of India 20 years later. Queen Victoria became Empress of India on January 1st, 1877. She was crowned by proxy. The coronation occurred in Delhi, and she would never actually set foot in India. Still, the ceremony was an enormously expensive affair, with jewel-encrusted elephants and long processions of Indian nobles dressed in traditional finery. It looked just like a Mughal coronation from a century earlier, and that was precisely the point. No longer would the British attempt to quote-unquote civilize India by patronizing Christian missionaries and promoting English modes of dress, manners, and culture. The British promised instead to respect traditional authorities, whether religious or princely, and would no longer interfere in Indian culture. With its emphasis on monarchy and hierarchy, this was meant to bind traditional elites ever closer to the British crown. And it was the crown that now governed in India. The East India Company's misgovernment and failure to prevent the rising caused Parliament to revoke its charter. Traditional elites were meant to be a bulwark against any repeat of the events of 1857, and by all accounts this strategy worked. There would be resistance to British rule in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but it would not come from Indian princes. Queen Victoria promised, in the immediate aftermath of the mutiny, not to impose Christianity on India. She strictly forbade any of her subjects from interfering in the religious liberties of another, though she added that all of her subjects should enjoy the equal and impartial protection of the law. This clause, so broad that it could be interpreted to include her British as well as Indian subjects, would serve as an inspirational benchmark for later generations of Indian nationalists, who denounced the British for failing to live up to their commitments. Such denunciations would also be echoed in Britain itself. British public opinion was no monolith. Some Britons eagerly celebrated empire, while others thought it wasteful and authoritarian, even un-British in their view. All could see the difference between the way the empire was being run in, say, Canada, which possessed voting rights, a parliament, and a constitution, and India, which possessed none of these things. To some in Britain, this was altogether fitting and proper. Indians were supposedly not ready for self-government, which had to be taught by the British, presumably over a period of centuries, much like the Romans had once taught the ancient Britons how to govern themselves. Otherwise, India would descend into anarchy and tyranny. To others in Britain, this was intolerable. India should with all haste be granted responsible government and be governed as a dominion. And at the very least, local government should be controlled by Indians themselves. The British Viceroy Lord Ripon was among those who believed the latter. In 1883, he issued a bill drafted by a member of his council, Sir Courtenay Ilbert, that would allow Indian judges at the district level the ability to try any case in their jurisdiction, including those that involved whites. To Ripon, this was a natural step in the granting of responsible government. After all, Australian judges had jurisdiction over British officials in criminal and civil matters. But in India, this news shocked the small white population, which was furious that Indians, whom they thought to be inferior to themselves, could sit in judgment of any cases involving them. Whites had their own courts under the overall authority of the crown, and they did not want to give them up. This blatantly racist reaction was repeated in Britain itself, and Ripon would withdraw the bill the following year. This reaction aroused lasting bitterness in India, as promises of equality once again proved to be hollow. A growing community of educated middle-class Indians were especially deflated at the news. This was the sort of community that men like Thomas Babington Macaulay would have liked to see rise to prominence in India, intellectuals and businessmen who spoke fluent English, wore Western clothes, and played cricket. They continued to grow throughout the 19th century, despite Britain's promotion of traditional elites in the wake of the Sepoy Mutiny. Many, like the young Jawaharlal Nehru, went to school in England. Nehru would graduate from both the elite Harrow School and from Trinity College, Cambridge. A tiny community of expatriate Indians moved to Britain permanently, entranced by the dynamic opportunities they encountered there. These included greater political rights. Indians in England could vote if they met the proper property qualifications, and found that Englishmen in England treated them with much greater respect than did Englishmen in India. In 1892, Indian immigrant Dadabhai Naoroji would become the first non-white member of the British Parliament, having been elected as the Liberal MP for the Finsbury Central District in London. Naoroji was well known as a founding member of another political institution, the Indian National Congress. Established in 1885 in the aftermath of the Ilbert Bill, this was an organization of mostly westernized Indians who sought to press for greater political rights within the empire. At first, their demands would be limited to local self-government, but they would expand to include full dominion status and finally independence itself. It's at this point that we should introduce a central figure in this transition, Mohandas Gandhi. Born to a well-off family in 1869, Gandhi followed many of his westernized peers to London, where he trained as a lawyer at the Inns of Court. He returned to India to practice law, but after 2 difficult years he traveled to South Africa to represent an Indian merchant in a court case. This trip, which would turn into a long 21-year stay, would be something of a political awakening for Gandhi. He arrived in South Africa, as he put it, a Briton first and an Indian second. Upon his arrival, however, he was forcibly ejected from a whites-only train, rebuked for not taking off his turban in court, and batoned by a police officer for walking on the sidewalk, which non-whites in South Africa were not allowed to do. Seeing firsthand a level of discrimination he had not encountered either in England or in India, Gandhi was roused to action. He helped establish the Natal Indian Congress in 1906 and would later organize a mass burning of the registration cards that Indians were forced to carry at all times. His companions in the Natal Indian Congress included Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, all working in harmony for what he saw as the interests of all Indians. His experience in South Africa among this expatriate community would both prepare him for the coming independence struggle in India and also underprepare him for the religious animosities between people who were not part of a common expatriate community. In 1915, Gandhi returned to India, which was then fighting alongside the rest of the empire in the First World War. Over 1 million Indians served on the Western Front, where they fought alongside Britons, Australians, Canadians, and other empire troops. Some 74,000 never returned home. Many hoped that their wartime service would be rewarded in the form of greater rights and liberties, together with the creation of an Indian parliament. The British government promised to grant what it called progressive self-government, a vague phrase that nationalists thought meant full dominion status. It did not. Instead, the British proposed only minor reforms to local government at the end of the war. When disappointed nationalists protested these reforms, the government responded with the repressive Rowlatt Act, which granted the viceroy wide powers to curb sedition by censoring the press, breaking up assemblies, and detaining activists without trial. Public protests escalated nonetheless, and in April 1919, a crowd of roughly 15,000 people convened in a small square in the city of Amritsar to condemn government policy. The local British commander, Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, ordered troops into the square to disperse the crowd. They opened fire on the unarmed protesters, killing as many as 1,500 men, women, and children. The Amritsar Massacre, as it came to be known, provoked outrage around the world. A wave of strikes swept across India, but protests also occurred in Europe, America, and South Africa. British public opinion was more mixed. Some defended Dyer on the racist reasoning that he was defending white women from an Indian mob. An editorial in the Daily Telegraph claimed that, quote, Englishmen decline, and rightly so, to take any chances so far as their wives and daughters are concerned. We do not wonder that the name of General Dyer is universally held in honor at the present moment by English women in northern India. Most Britons, however, condemned the massacre. Winston Churchill, then the colonial secretary and the most prominent defender of British imperialism in India, thought Dyer's actions were reprehensible. He believed that any repeat of the Amritsar massacre would work to Britain's detriment. Our reign in India, he noted, or anywhere else, has never stood on the basis of physical force alone, and it would be fatal to the British Empire if we were to try to base ourselves only upon it. Reginald Dyer was unrepentant, but he was ultimately censured by the House of Commons and forced to resign. Churchill wanted him court-martialed, but he was overruled. Churchill's warning that British power could not rest on physical force alone was prophetic. Mohandas Gandhi agreed with Churchill's assessment, though for him this meant that nationalists had to challenge the consent that so many Indians offered to the British. This was the inspiration for Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign, which he launched in 1921, though for Gandhi this meant pressuring Indians from withdrawing their consent from all aspects of modern life, not just British rule. We can see this justification for a lost and supposedly pure way of living in Hind Swaraj, which was symbolized by the simple technology of the spinning wheel, and which was also the reading for this week. In Gandhi's non-cooperation campaign, Indians were to withdraw from every aspect of modern British life. They were to burn their Western clothes and furniture, throw away any honors they received from the British government, any titles, renounce any degrees from British universities or any honorary positions bestowed upon them, resign from any official posts they held, desert en masse from the army or from the police, and then all were to refuse to pay any taxes to the Raj. This campaign was a huge mass movement, but its influence was a lot more limited than such campaigns would be later. Of the 5,000 title holders in India, only about 100 or so renounced their titles. Of these, some, like a barrister in Calcutta who renounced his membership in the Royal Society, continued to hold on to their titles privately and would still put RS after his name. Students went on strike, but they were back a few months later after a long vacation. The allure of a Western-style future was still important for many upwardly mobile Indians. But among India's poor, the movement became a rallying cry. Large crowds of Hindus and Muslims protested in major towns and cities, pressing on police to resign. They would also pressure store owners to stop selling Western goods and clothes, but then things went awry. Radical Muslim clerics who were uncomfortable with cooperating with Hindus started to demand a different style of movement. Many began to call for a jihad, while others started to just directly attack Hindus. Gandhi was furious at this shift. At one point, he came across 2 dying policemen and had them carried to the hospital, and he launched hunger strike after hunger strike to curb the violence. Mobs set police headquarters on fire and then butchered the police as they came out. It was all too much, and Gandhi eventually called it off. In the aftermath of this campaign, Gandhi was arrested for sedition, ably defended himself, and then pled guilty and demanded the harshest sentence the law would allow. In 1922, he was sentenced to 6 years in prison. He came down with dysentery and then appendicitis, and the government released him early, fearful that he might die in prison and thus be a martyr to the nationalist cause. Gandhi continued to campaign for nonviolent protest, though, arguing that any violent revolution to overthrow British rule would replace one group of oppressors with another. Nonviolent protest was meant to be theatrical. To protest the British monopoly on the production and sale of salt, for instance, Gandhi in 1930 led hundreds of Indians on a march of 240 miles to the coast where he picked up a handful of salt from the sea. This attracted a tremendous amount of press attention, and so too did the police crackdown on peaceful Indians picketing salt companies. Gandhi thought nonviolence would expose the brutality of British rule. If Indians challenged unjust laws but refused to fight back, the British public would refuse to stomach any violent crackdown. This was a tactic that would not have worked against every European imperialist power. In 1937, for instance, the British Lord Halifax asked Adolf Hitler for advice on how to handle Gandhi and his movement. Hitler responded by saying that the British should immediately shoot Gandhi, and if the nationalist leadership continued to make a fuss, then the British should shoot all of them too. Halifax was taken aback and dropped it. The British were never going to do this, at least not as long as the nationalist movement remained nonviolent. Gandhi reasoned that it was much easier to justify using coercive measures against people using violence, whatever their cause, than to suppress people committing no violence at all. He was, as he put it, pulling on Britain's conscience. By the 1930s, even the most die-hard imperialist figures within the British cabinet could see that concessions were necessary. In 1935, Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which provided a measure of self-government to many parts of the subcontinent, though not quite dominion status. This was perhaps a consequence of the greater independence now enjoyed by British dominions, which had been reorganized by the Statutes of Westminster in 1931. The statutes recognized both the Dominions and the UK as equal states under the British Crown, which effectively meant that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and South Africa were independent countries with George V as their titular head of state. Dominion status would have therefore meant independence for India, and the British weren't ready to grant that yet. India was the source of much of Britain's power in the world. Britain relied on India as a market and on Indian tax revenue to finance a whole host of overseas investments. Indian troops by the 1930s were posted to many far-flung corners of the British Empire as well. As early as 1905, the Viceroy Lord Curzon declared that if Britain ever lost India, it would sink almost immediately to a third-rate power. In the interwar period, the challenge to British India came mostly from within, from nationalist protests and civil disobedience. But after 1941, the challenge would come from another imperialist power, Japan. The British Empire in East Asia extended beyond India, of course. Burma and Malaya were under British control, as were two major cities, Hong Kong, leased by the British until 1997, and Singapore, a huge commercial hub and naval base. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, was part of a larger campaign against European and American possessions across the Pacific. The Japanese also bombed Manila and would shortly thereafter invade the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya. An army of 30,000 Japanese raced towards Singapore, where the British military had started, but not finished, building massive defensive works. The dense jungle north of Singapore was thought to be impenetrable, and since the British expected an attack to come from the sea, the heaviest artillery was designed to fend off a seaborne attack. It's not true that the British weren't able to turn their guns around to face north. That's a persistent myth of the fall of Singapore. But the British were unprepared for attack to come by land. When it did, the commanders of the 85,000-strong British force were so surprised that they didn't even know what to do. Thinking the Japanese force was much larger than it actually was, the British surrendered. The Japanese would inflict unimaginable horrors on the British and Indian POWs, beating and starving them and conscripting the emaciated survivors to build a railway across Malaya. A somewhat sanitized version of this appears in the bridge over the River Kwai, if any of you have seen the film. It's hard to overstate the psychological blow inflicted by the fall of Singapore. Even at the time, people thought that it indicated the end of the British Empire. Churchill himself thought it was the worst defeat ever suffered by the United Kingdom. With Japanese bombs also raining down on northern Australia, the Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, declared that henceforth Australia would rely for its defense on the United States. Realizing that Indian support for the war was crucial, Churchill dispatched Sir Stafford Cripps to meet with the Indian National Congress. The British had brought India into the war in 1939, and while Congress generally wished to see fascism defeated, many nationalists resented that India had not been consulted at all. Cripps offered Dominion status in exchange for full-throated support for the war, with Dominion status to be granted after it was over. This was not enough for Congress leader Jawaharlal Nehru, but it was eagerly endorsed by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim League, who aimed to curry British favor for his goal of a separate homeland for India's Muslims. Gandhi, who had written to Hitler at the beginning of the war urging him to achieve his goals using peaceful methods, refused to accept Cripps' proposals, and instead gave a speech in August 1942 in which he demanded that Britain immediately, as he put it, quit India. If Britain did not withdraw from the entire subcontinent as quickly as possible, then Gandhi promised mass civil disobedience across the entire country. With the Japanese army headed toward Bengal, this was a nightmare for the British cabinet. Within hours of this speech, both Gandhi, Nehru, and much of the entire Congress leadership had been arrested, and the British would hold them in prison for the duration of the war. Gandhi's Quit India movement had almost no Muslim support. It also alienated a growing faction of radical Hindu nationalists who condemned Gandhi and his nonviolent methods as weak. This group, led by a Nazi sympathizer named Subhas Chandra Bose, looked to Germany and Japan as a means of ridding India of the British. Both Axis powers cultivated this movement, with Japan allowing Subhas Chandra Bose to raise his own national army among Indian prisoners in Japanese POW camps. Many saw themselves and the Germans as fellow Aryans, a common master race destined to exterminate the inferior English. You can see an example of this in Indian National Army propaganda. This poster condemning the Amritsar massacre, for instance, portrays the British soldiers as Jews with long noses. The subtext was very clear. Bose would ultimately raise 43,000 men for his Indian National Army, which would fight British troops across Southeast Asia in what came to be known as the Burma Campaign. The Japanese never managed to invade India, but the pressures of war provoked a famine in Bengal in 1943. This was mainly caused by the scorched earth policies adopted by both sides in Burma, where much of Bengal's rice imports came from, but wartime rationing elsewhere in India limited the amount of possible relief. The disaster was aggravated by British mismanagement. The government initially denied that there was a problem at all, then sought to fix the price of rice, which caused a booming black market. As many as 3 million Bengalis died. When the war came to an end in 1945, it was clear that the British could no longer govern India. The only question was what independence would actually look like. Gandhi wanted a single federal Indian state with a power-sharing arrangement between Hindus and Muslims, but both Nehru and Jinnah preferred that India be divided into Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority states. The new Labour government in Britain was committed to a speedy transfer of power, and it appointed Lord Mountbatten as the last Viceroy of India. Mountbatten and his wife quickly became close with Nehru. In fact, Lady Mountbatten and Nehru almost certainly had an affair. But Mountbatten had little control over events as they unfolded. He had been instructed to ensure that independence be peaceful and orderly, and while he hoped to leave behind a united India, he agreed to a partition plan with Congress and the Muslim League that would create 2 independent states, India and Pakistan, with an independence date of August 15, 1947. Any hopes that the transfer of power would actually be peaceful were swept aside by communal violence. Millions of Hindus in what was to become Pakistan and millions of Muslims in what was to become India packed their belongings and headed toward their new religiously affiliated states. Along the way, many were subjected to horrific violence or inflicted it themselves on those they passed by. Mohandas Gandhi launched a hunger strike in protest, which did succeed after a time in abating the violence. But Gandhi's strike offended some of the more radical Hindu nationalists, including a young man by the name of Nathuram Godse. As Gandhi walked through the garden of Birla House on his way to address a prayer meeting in January 1948, Godse intercepted him and fired 3 bullets at point-blank range. Gandhi died about a half hour later. At least 2 million Indians attended his funeral. Jawaharlal Nehru, now India's first prime minister, mourned Gandhi's loss in an address to the nation. Gandhi's assassination discredited the radical wing of the nationalist movement, at least for a time, and India would be governed as an officially secular state. Pakistan, though it defined itself as a homeland for Indian Muslims, would also possess a secular constitution. Muhammad Ali Jinnah drank heavily and boasted that he liked eating pork for breakfast, clearly not the most vigorous and devout Muslim. But Pakistan would begin to move in a more Islamist direction after Jinnah's death, especially under the Prime Minister Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s. The two countries remained divided over Kashmir, which had been a majority Muslim princely state whose Hindu Maharaja elected to join India at independence in 1947 and 48. The legacy of Britain's empire in India is far from over.